All right, so we are live right now, and I'm here with Chuck Allgood and Brandon Marshall from Chemours. Do I say that right? Chemours, is that the right pronunciation?
That is the right way.
All right, good.
You got it.
So we're going to be talking about refrigerants. We've actually done some podcasts recently, so those will be those actually are already out on the podcast feed. But I wanted to get together with both you guys and just talk a little bit through kind of what's coming up, and then also one of the big questions that we often get is just what makes a good refrigerant? Like what, if we had our list of perfect traits, what would those be, and kind of how we balance that moving forward. So I actually want to start with Brandon because we talked last, just talking about regulations and all that and everything that's coming down the pike. So give us a kind of a brief overview of why we're having this conversation and what are some of the things we have to kind of navigate moving forward.
Yeah, definitely, Brian. So like we had on our last show, we talked a little bit about the California CARB regulations that were coming in. Residential split systems, less than 750 GWP by January 1st, 2025. What that means for a lot of the contractors out there is no more new 410A systems in the state of California, right? It's going to be moving to next-gen products. In this case, a lot of the major OEMs have been going with XL41 or 454B, which is one of the products that we're highlighting at the expo here.
And that's in the Opteon brand, right?
That is the Opteon branded product. That's correct. When you look at a national level, the U.S. EPA has been in the process of making rulemakings under the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, or AIM for short. We have a lot of information about AIM on our website. It's a pretty heavy topic, so we won't be able to get through everything here
right.
today. But do feel free to visit opteon.com, and you can download a couple of our 2-page guides. The long and short summary of it is the EPA is going to be phasing down the use of HFCs. So very similar to what we saw with R22 under the Montreal Protocol, we're going to start moving down over the next 15 years and reducing our consumption and use in the field. A second piece of that we're expecting to see as we move through this is going to be comparable sector controls like we saw in California. So less than 750 GWP at X date for new equipment.
Right.
Okay. When the EPA rolls something like this out, it's across the nation, right? So while there are states like California who have regulated and we have dates for their rulemaking, the EPA will put out dates that'll cover all the other parts of the country that don't already have a rulemaking in place. So it's going to cover the other 49 states.
And those aren't in place yet on the EPA at the EPA level.
That's correct. Right. They're being discussed now.
Got it. And so so like it often is the case, California kind of sets the hard line. But for manufacturers, they don't have a choice because of course, California is one of, if not the largest HVAC market in the country. So they have to start to build equipment that's going to match that. And so that's what's going to hit the market. So talk a little bit about, actually, I'll go ahead and move it over to Chuck. Let's talk a little bit about when creating a new refrigerant. I mean, because that's what we're dealing with now.
Right.
We're having to, Chemours is having to come out and Opteon and say, okay, what is going to make for a refrigerant that's going to be really good for the marketplace? And obviously they came out with a really good option, but what are some of the things that they had to consider when developing a refrigerant, or things we should think about?
First of all, it really is a balancing act. It's not just one criteria.
Right.
It would be easy if it was that way, but it's always been kind of performance first. It's got to do its job, or else none of the other things matter. So the thermodynamic properties in terms of equipment, cooling capacity, and energy efficiency are the two big metrics that you want to hit. And a lot of times what we're doing is trying to match something that's already out there. So 410 was a little bit different than R22, but the 454B, we just mentioned, that was really designed to match as closely as possible 410 performance. And we do that with all refrigerants. If it's an R12, 134A kind of looked like R12, and then the things coming behind it. But then after you get the performance, then you start thinking of things like toxicity, flammability, environmental properties. We need them to be non-ozone depleting all at this point. Now we want them to be low global warming potential, cost, being able to manufacture. That's kind of behind the scenes that a lot of the industry doesn't see until they get it in the jug. But Chemours has to invest a lot of money in building chemical plants to manufacture this stuff and to distribute it across the world.
Yeah, it has to be available. I mean, it's one thing. It's one thing to come up with an idealistic product. It's another thing to build economies of scale to actually deliver it to the trade, which is a big thing. Which is why I think we're seeing we're seeing this refrigerant and R32 kind of emerge as the two options because of the investment that's existed. In the case of R32, it's been out for a really long time. So for some people, it's like, all right, well, that's an obvious choice. Talk about that just from a high level, because this is what a lot of the conversations are coming down to. What's the difference between, and again, this isn't like throwing anything under the bus here. It's just what are the difference between these two, between R32 and the refrigerant that Opteon has?
So Opteon is a blend based on an HFO. 1234YF is the HFO ingredient, along with R32. So you look at neat R32, it's going to have a higher GWP, in the 600 range versus 454B, which gets down into the 400 range. And we're squeezing the range of GWPs. We came from very, very high stuff in the thousands. Yeah. People think 404, 507, around 4,000 is high, but the R12, R11 were even higher than that. But in the outer years of the phase down, those GW points are going to be important. So I think that's a major decision factor for a big OEM to invest in a product platform.
Yeah, you want to kind of future proof it. I mean, you don't want to make a decision and then say, oh, well, now there's a new regulation and now we got to go away from R32 again.
Exactly.
That's a big consideration in terms of the performance of the refrigerant. How do you feel it kind of stacks up to R410A?
I think performance-wise, I think it's a very good replacement alternative. I don't want to call it a replacement because it's not going to go in R10.
Right. It's not going to retrofit. That's a key thing we have to be clear about here, because a lot of people will ask, what's going to be the retrofit for R410A? And the answer is, at this stage, nothing. Yeah, nothing.
Right. Yeah. Right. So yeah, performance-wise, it's a very good replacement. It has a discharge temperature, advantages over R32. Same lubricants, same tools. It's going to be mildly flammable. It's going to be the A2L category, so that will have to be taken into account and mitigated, both in terms of the OEM's equipment and what they put on there, any sensors or extra ventilation, and then the service contractors. Will have to have recovery machines related for A2L. A lot of the tools will be the same, and get everybody trained on that. Those are the big differences. I think it's going to be an A2L, but performance-wise, it's going to be very, very similar to 410.
So a lot of technicians ask in terms of doing, connecting to the equipment. Some people had talked about, well, maybe there'll be left-hand threads, maybe there'll be, something like that. Is there going to be any significant changes that you see coming down the pike for technicians in terms of servicing the equipment?
I'm not sure where the industry is. Maybe Brandon knows on the left-hand thread thing. The cylinders have a red stripe on them or a red top. There'll be things like, it's a flammable refrigerant. I don't know if that's been resolved yet or.
Yeah, definitely. So actually there's an ongoing dialogue about the cylinders. Do we want to have those left-handed threads on there? When you look at the equipment right now though, and where the equipment manufacturers have been working, they're going to use traditional right-handed threads.
Got it.
So we've been, and if you guys have feedback or feedback comes through your audience, we're trying to understand left or right and what's going to make the most sense. On the right-handed side of things, that's what we use today, right? It's nothing different. When you think about left-handed threads, it prevents somebody trying to charge a 410A system with an A2L product. Right. So it helps to prevent the mixing. You have to take that extra step, but there is an ongoing conversation around that. So if the viewership has feedback, we'd be excited to hear that.
I think generally people are going to not want to have to get adapters. That's sort of the easy answer. But yeah, to your point, we don't want to walk up to a system that we assume has R410A in it and then end up that somebody put a different refrigerant in it, maybe a homeowner or a maintenance person or something like that. So that is, we don't want to accidentally have an A2L in there, and that would help prevent that. So it is an interesting question. As far as A2Ls in general, though, let's kind of peg that, because I think a lot of people hear flammable. These are flammable refrigerants, and they immediately start to think of hydrocarbons, things like propane and isobutane, and kind of because a lot of us have received training on that. We've received training on R290. Anyone who works in the refrigeration space has started to see it come out in these small self-contained systems. And so I think a lot of folks think that the precautions and everything have to be to that same level. So how would you kind of describe the difference between, an R290 propane type refrigerant and an A2L refrigerant?
The best explanation I heard a few years ago from a former colleague of mine said, if you were trying to make a fire with an A2L refrigerant, you'd be severely disappointed. It's it's hard to ignite. It doesn't burn very well. If it does ignite, it doesn't propagate a flame very well, and it doesn't give off a lot of energy when it does burn. So in terms of things we measure in the laboratory, things like burning velocity or heat of combustion or minimum ignition energy, those get into real detailed engineering. How much of a spark does it take to set off an A2L once you've reached a flammable concentration?
Right.
Can static from walking across a carpet do it, or do you really need some type of torch to get this stuff to burn? And then does it burn like a birthday candle, or does it explode like in a ball of flame? So the A2Ls are much on the very gentle side of that.
Right.
They're barely get into the flammable category on a number of those metrics, but they are different than the A1s, and we need to take the appropriate precautions. But to me, they're a lot more similar to A1s than they are to an A3.
Right.
But we do have to have the appropriate safety mitigation in place.
Yeah, and actually, I think a lot of people don't realize this, but this A2L designation is kind of a new thing. Like this hasn't been around a long time. Before it was A1, A2, A3. So Brandon, would you care to just kind of comment on that a little bit? And just there is a difference there, even between A2s and A2Ls, and that's the reason why that new designation was come up with.
Definitely. So when you think about every refrigerant out there today, there's a possibility that they can combust. Okay. The tests that we use in the laboratory and what a lot of Chuck's team has been working on is we essentially have a glass bulb, and it has a metal line in there that has about a 90-degree angle. If it burns inside of that 90-degree angle, it's classified as an A1. As you start to get further off of that 90-degree angle, that's when it goes A2, A3. With a lot of the new refrigerants, they were only slightly over that 90-degree angle in the glass bulb. So because of that, we had to create a new designation because they weren't falling into an A2. They weren't getting even close to it. They were closer to the A1 side, but they still needed to recognize that there is that mildly flammable portion to it versus a 410A. So this is more or less how industry came up with the 2L designation, and that was to support that lower flammability limit that we see with a lot of these products.
Right. And I think it's also worth noting, all of these things are designated through doing a battery of tests. But when we say things like non-flammable, that's also a bit of a misnomer because, I mean, everything, I shouldn't say everything, but most everything is flammable to some degree or another. And so even A1s, because people will point out, R410A in the right conditions will burn. Well, that is true. I mean, if you have a really hot house fire, it will burn. But so when we say non-flammable, it's just a designation that we're giving something based on a set of tests in order to hit a certain standard. And so sometimes when we get, I guess what I'm saying is sometimes we get worked up about things because like this is flammable, that isn't flammable. Just realize that all of this is on a spectrum, So
Yes.
we're doing our due diligence to say this is more flammable than an A1, right? So you do need to take some more precautions. But what we don't want to do is get this idea that you're carrying something that's the equivalent of gasoline or propane in your truck. But on the flip side, and this is me talking, this is not Chemours. I'm always trying to kind of placate the audience to make sure they don't, get too worried. We deal with things that are far more flammable all the time. You take a tank of propane, you put it in the back of your truck, you drive it home, you hook it up, and your 10-year-old kid lights the grill, right? I mean, this sort of stuff happens all the time. It's all about proper practices. As long as we follow proper practices, it will be safe. If we do not follow proper practices, then it will not be safe. And again, this is me talking, but I just want to say this because a lot of these things occur because of regulation, because of just where we're at, and then companies have to come up with solutions for these things. But it's nothing to be afraid of if you do what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's other parts of our industry that deal with it. People are warehousing large quantities of systems or large quantities of jugs of refrigerant. So, and they have to have special, precautions around their operations, and as well as people who are pulling out torches and working on a piece of equipment with a refrigerant, flammable or otherwise. And all flammability, as you mentioned, is according to some standard. And a stack of paper sitting on my desk will burn if I put a torch to it, but it's not gonna. I'm not worried if somebody flips a light switch that it's gonna go. So it's all a matter of perspective on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk a little bit about it. This is maybe a little out of order on this podcast, but it's something that I think people think of a lot. The differences between the transition from R22 to R410A and what we faced in that transition versus what we're going to face in the transition from R410A to the next generation of Opteon refrigerants.
So I was thinking back, R22 was such a great refrigerant, and I've heard that a lot over the past 2 days here at the show. Yeah. And it was used in so many different places. Big chillers, residential AC, commercial refrigerant, low temp, medium temp. And so there wasn't going to be one refrigerant place replaces all those applications, but particularly where 410 is now, there was no good single component that could look exactly like R22. And there was a little bit of debate in the product development. There was a 410A and a 410B back in the day, and they had similar properties, but not exactly the same. And I think the industry converged on one. But there was a little worry. That's a time when blends were first coming in, and people, oh my goodness, this is a blend. It has multiple components. Is it going to stay together? Is it going to fly apart?
Right.
If it leaks, then the pressures were a little bit higher, and there was a lot of concern around the pressure of 410 back then, and we seem to have gotten over that. I'm glad. I knew we could. We've just like the industry has come to be able to work with temperature glide, slightly higher pressures. So once we converged from 410 as an industry, there's a little bit of a hump learning curve to get over, but then I think everyone was off and running. And we're doing that again now. I think the pressures, temperatures, and all that handling going from 410 to something like 454B is going to, be very, very similar. But now we have the flammability thing is probably the new curveball that's gotten thrown at the industry. And we'll get through this, and it's going to be a big training effort. I think 2025 is not that far away in our time frames for transitioning, starting a big transition like this. So I see that as a big one. Training, education. That's what we're
that's what we're
about.
That's what we're doing here. So
Exactly.
So 454B compared to 410A in terms of glide. A lot of people get concerned about glide. It's something that a lot of techs aren't trained in, especially in air conditioning and refrigeration, or maybe overseas where people were dealt with the 407 series of refrigerants that have significantly higher glide. But in the U.S., we haven't had to deal with it. If you've been an air conditioning tech, you've maybe been trained on it, but you haven't had to use it. Is there going to be any significant difference between 410A and 454B?
I think if you look on paper, right, the glide of 410 might be 1 or 2 degrees, and 454B might be 3-4 degrees. So it's a little bit marginally a higher glide. I think for 410 you could almost ignore it and not run any problems. But I think you should do your best practices on setting superheat. Make sure you use the dew point if you have, depending on your PT chart or your PT app that you're using. Leak, recharge, topping off without having to pull the whole charge. That's not an issue. You'll be able to add a pound on top if you need to. I don't see any other issues there. Taking liquid out of the refrigerant jug when you're charging, I think those practices that people have been doing will work just fine for 454B. I don't see any glide issues.
Yeah, and again, as you start to work with refrigerants, even with slightly more glide, technicians are going to have to start paying attention to, like we said, dew point, bubble point, and midpoint. And that comes up sometimes when you're looking at your digital gauges. So I always like to say this because techs who haven't noticed this, for example, if you're using an app like MeasureQuick, when you look at the gauge, it's going to show you midpoint, because midpoint is sort of like the effective average. But if you're looking at superheat, that's going to be looking at dew point. And I always remind people, the way I remember this is it's duper heat. So dew point for superheat and bubble point for subcool. And so it's going to show you each one of those depending on what measurement you're taking. If you're using an analog gauge set or using something that doesn't have that intelligence in it, then you're going to have to pay attention to all three of those different measurements depending on what you're doing. Now, again, 454B, not going to be a huge deal, almost irrelevant, but just good thing to know. And you're not going to get away from it because, again, if you ever do any refrigeration or you're going to see much broader glides.
Yeah, I agree. Super duper is how I learned it.
Super
so
duper, there you
go. Stuck in my head. But you're right. I don't think you'll be too far off. But we should always do our best practices out there to set things up, and especially when we're troubleshooting, doing that kind of work. I think it's important to do those.
Yep, absolutely. So, what else do we need to cover for technicians? Any resources? Anything that we want to point people to have them learn more? There's probably some people watching who are even going to be on the show floor here shortly. So, anything we would suggest?
Yeah, definitely. Feel free to stop by our booth, of course, as always. We're right over in 2116 here on the Central Hall. So we'll be there all day until the show closes down here at 4 p.m. As we talked about when we did the podcast, Bryan, training is going to be key. So remain steadfast on the training side. We make a lot of resources available on our website. There's a lot of other groups out there that are also putting training together around A2L refrigerants. We talked a little bit about ESCO, and I know there's a few folks from ESCO that are walking around here. So hello if they're listening.
Yep.
And, as these programs are developing, again, go through the program, understand those differences that you're going to see. And just make sure that when you're working with these products, you're keeping the best practices that you've been using today, and keep an eye on the flammability side of things.
Yeah, the Opteon website's great. The Opteon YouTube channel is a great source. escogroup.org is a great place to go to learn more about A2Ls. Jason Avjud, he did a podcast and video with me, I don't know, a couple months back. So if you want to watch that, and then we obviously have the podcast that we did with Dr. Chuck and with Brandon recently out. So if you want to learn more in depth, go to those places. But yeah, it's great talking to you guys. Thanks for stopping by, and it's always a pleasure.
Thanks for having us, Bryan.
Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you.